Hi everyone, my name is Nicola Derolin, and in this video I'm going to talk about how we derive CCS values from ion mobility experiments. More precisely, I will describe the actual methods for deriving CCS values with particular focus on drift tube and traveling wave ion mobility. And I will also provide a few hypotheses that may answer the question, why is the CCS calibration in traveling wave dependent on the compound class? If we change calibrant mix, we might obtain a different CCS for the same analyte. Why is that? So let's start. How do we obtain CCS values in practice? Essentially, we could distinguish two main approaches. Scientists usually refer to primary and secondary methods. Primary methods measure directly reduced mobilities, K0, via the drift time, and then use the fundamental low-field ion mobility equation to derive the CCS, whereas secondary methods derive CCS values via a calibration curve. A primary method of measurement is also defined by the BIPM as a method having the highest metrological qualities, whose operation can be completely described and understood, for which a complete uncertainty statement can be written in terms of the international system, and whose results are accepted without reference to a standard of the quantity being measured. In other words, in primary methods, it should be possible to calculate the uncertainty of the measurand. I took this figure from a very good review written by the gurus of ion mobility, of the caliber of Bauer, Schwarzburg, Wittenbach, Gabellica, Bush, Giles, Campusano, and so on. There are 34 of them. And this review is a must read for anyone using or willing to use ion mobility, and it lays out the recommendations for reporting ion mobility measurements. In this image, the yellow color indicates the workflow, allowing one to estimate K0 and CCS values without using any reference compound, that is the primary method of measurement. The green color indicates the workflow using reference compounds, which are compounds of known K0 measured across multiple instruments and laboratories to verify or calibrate the instrument. The input variables related to the ions are highlighted in red. The variables related to the experimental setup are in blue, and in purple, the variables deduced from the measurements. The technology that today allows the use of primary methods is the drift tube ion mobility, the DTIMS. Traveling wave, trapped ion mobility, TWIMS, and differential mobility analyzer, DMA, derived the CCS values via an instrumental calibration function determined using reference compounds. DMA, I have to say that DMA can also be used as a primary method by precise knowledge of the applied voltage, DMA dimensions, and fluid flow rates into the device, although usually a calibration function is applied. The primary method using the drift tube technology is also called the step field method, as it is performed by recording the arrival time of an ion at different fields. And for the calculation of reduced mobilities and derivation of CCS values, the workflow is very simple. A standard solution containing the analyte of interest is infused directly into the ion source. The arrival time of our ionized analyte is recorded by ramping, or better said, stepping the delta voltage in the drift tube. And typical discrete steps are in the range of 850 and 1450 volts. We can then plot a linear regression and of the arrival time as a function of the inverse of the delta voltage, and the intercept is the T0, that is the time ions spent outside of the drift region, whilst the slope is represented by the factor b, which is a constant. We can calculate the reduced mobility by applying the inverse formula. And finally, we use the fundamental low-field ion mobility equation for deriving the CCS. Obviously, this method can be only used if we have the pure standards of a compound. And working with standard solution might be okay, although the step field method is not suitable if we want to derive the CCS of an unknown compound present in a complex sample. In this case, we will probably need to couple the ion mobility mass spectrometer to a chromatographer to get advantage of the chromatographic separation and get rid of at least some interferences. To do so, on a drift tube, we should make use of a secondary method, the so-called single field method. Here we need to calibrate our drift tube by infusing a mix of calibrants, which are compounds of known CCS, charge, state, and mass. We can plot a linear regression curve representing the arrival time as a function of the term including CCS, charge, and the ratio of the masses. And in this way, we will then obtain the slope, beta, and the intercept T fixed. We can use the calibration equation to derive the CCS of unknown compounds, as long as calibrant mix and samples are analyzed under the same experimental settings. And this is extremely important because beta is our slope, is a number, is a constant. It depends on the drift gas employed, on the ion transfer settings outside of a drift region, on the gas pressure, temperature, electric fields, and geometry of the drift cell. If we change any of these parameters from the calibration to the experiment, or from experiment to experiment, then we introduce an important bias and the derivation of CCS fails. Careful not to confuse T-fix with T0 here. T-fix contributes to the calculation of T0. For the traveling wave technology, I mentioned before that CCS values cannot be derived from first principles, but must be obtained following calibration with standards of known CCS, like the single field method for drift tubes. Although a few papers describe the modification of the fundamental low field IMS equation for specific application like the separation of separation structural identification of compounds in petroleomics, as well as alternative modes of operation of the T-wave mobility separator to allow direct determination of ion mobility values and subsequently collision cross-section data. But because these approaches lead to deviations slightly higher than those obtained through calibration, in commercial systems, the secondary method is used routinely. To calibrate the traveling wave system, first of all, we need to calculate the normalized CCS values by multiplying the known CCS of the calibrants for the square root of the reduced mass, mu, and divide by the charge state of the ion. Then the arrival time of each calibrant is acquired, and the drift time of corrected arrival time is calculated by subtracting the product of the square root of the mass to charge by a constant c. C is given by the enhanced duty cycle delay coefficient of the instrument, and you can divide the EDC by 1000 to get C. And typical EDC values range between 1.4 and 1.8 for commercial SYNAPT. Obviously, the EDC coefficient is only valid if the exit length of the transfer T wave guide and transfer ion optics are the same as used when setting up the ADC for calibration. The normalized CCS versus drift time are fitted using an empirically determined power law equation, which will be the calibration curve. Here I reported an example from a paper of Ahmed and Matt Bush. The coefficient A and the exponential factor B will be used for the derivation of CCS of unknown compounds. Some authors advanced different functions for describing the relation between the normalized CCS and the drift time in traveling wave. For example, Bush and co-workers proposed a binomial regression function. At present, the commercial traveling wave system, Synapse and Vion from Waters, use the formula that includes the T0, the undetermined time offset. At, um, at this point, I have two important considerations that deserve a space here. Firstly, all these relationships for traveling wave are purely empirical. There is no theory behind them. They can be considered the best fit mathematical equation that describe the relation between the CCS and the drift time. Secondly, one could question where we get the reference CCS from. The CCS of the mix of compounds used for building the calibration curve are CCS derived from step field drift tube measurements. This means that we are calibrating traveling wave and any other IMS technology, including TWIMS, on derivations of drift tube measurements. But where do the reference calibrants come from? Well, thanks to the work of the pioneers of ion mobility, we have a database of drift tube derived CCS for series of compound classes. Usually we keep as reference CCS in helium the values from Klemmer group and in nitrogen the values from Bush group. Here I propose a mass spectrum of polyalanine mix which has been used historically to calibrate commercial traveling wave systems, and highlighted in red are the reference CCS values in nitrogen as buffer gas. And in this is a typical arrival time distribution of polyalanine on a Synapse G2S system, and we can see how the peak becomes broader as the permanence time in the drift cells increases. Here is an example of the calibration curve automatically calculated by DriftScope, the software on the Synapse, which is represented by the classical power law function. And here an example of the figures of the coefficients, including T0 for the current traveling wave technology. I took a slice of the calibration summary from the Vion in our lab. Now that we know how to derive CCS values, there is a little detail that deserves a few minutes when we consider traveling wave measurements. Essentially, over the years, it has been found that the calibration on traveling wave systems is dependent on the chemical class of the reference compound. In other words, the calibration curve, the equation of the calibration curve can change if we consider native proteins versus denaturated proteins, or lipids versus peptides, for example. And this means that if possible, we should calibrate the traveling wave system matching the chemical class of the analytes that we are studying. But the big question is, why does this class dependence exist? A few hypotheses can be advanced. The first hypothesis is that maybe the reduced mobility in traveling wave is different from the reduced mobility in drift tube, because in traveling wave we might not be in the low field limit. We have seen in the first video that we can consider to be working under weak electric fields if the drift velocity is small compared to the thermal velocity. which is the zero field average relative ion neutral speed. At 300 Kelvin in nitrogen, for example, the thermal speed is estimated to be about 450 meters per second, which is quite close to the drift velocity of modern commercial traveling wave system. So the assumption of being working in the low field limit might be not fully satisfied, especially because in traveling wave the field experienced by the ions is constantly changing. Thus, the drift velocity is also constantly changing. In fact, ions are pushed and accelerated by the wave at first, but then they eventually get overtaken. Larger ions more than smaller ions, and there is a moment when the module and direction of the velocity is zero or even negative. This is basically the principle of separation in traveling wave ion mobility. However, also in trapped ion mobility, TWIMS, we work at quite high um, fields, quite high E over N ratios, and the drift velocity is of the same order of magnitude compared to the thermal velocity. But in TWIMS, we do not see this behavior. I mean, by contrast to the traveling wave, in TWIMS there is not a compound class dependence. This means that probably the main reason is not completely holding this hypothesis. A second hypothesis, which is related to the first hypothesis really, is that the effective temperature experienced by the ions is not constant for all compounds. And because at higher fields there is also a contribution of the E over N to the effective temperature following the two-temperature theory, if the E over N changes, the effective temperature changes with it. Therefore, the constant R is not a constant anymore. But compounds belonging to the same class can have similar CCS dependence from the experienced temperature. The range of fields used in so-called linear methods can differ quite a lot, and effective temperature higher than the gas temperature may be reached in traveling wave ion mobility, TWIMS, or in drift tube ion mobility at high fields. And this can be a plausible explanation. A third hypothesis can arise from the fact that we calibrate traveling wave from drift tube values, either in helium or in nitrogen, typically. However, in some commercial systems like the Synapse G2SI or the Synapse XS, a helium cell is present just before the ion mobility cell to cool down the ions before entering the drift cell um, from when they come from the trap to avoid basically unwanted fragmentation. This causes the presence of a mixture of gases in the drift cells composed by prevalently nitrogen, but with some helium as well. And the nature of uh, the buffer gas influences the reduced mobility, the CCS resulted to be affected as well. And ions belonging to the same compound class could behave differently from ions belonging to a different class. A fourth hypothesis is that velocity relaxation effects are present. In other words, the ions do not respond immediately to field changes. Therefore, their drift velocity is somehow influenced by the constantly changing field, but with relaxation effects. This was proposed for the first time by Richardson and co-workers in 2018 in a research paper published in the American Journal of Mass Spectrometry, where they derived the exact expressions for the trajectory and transit time of ions in a smoothly moving sinusoidal traveling wave device, considering symmetric waveforms. The average velocity of an ion in traveling wave devices with a mobility k is given by this formula, where lambda is the wavelength and the period t is given by the integral from 0 to lambda of the inverse of the difference wave velocity v and the product k per the electric field over one wavelength. If we introduce the concept of a sinusoidal function representing the axial potential in traveling wave devices, the average ion velocity becomes this. And then if we consider the anharmonic correction to waveform, the average ion wave velocity can be described as a polynomial function in omega 0 squared and gamma squared, the maximum ion velocity relative to the traveling wave velocity. To account for velocity relaxation, they introduced a dimensionless parameters, alpha, which is the ratio of the relaxation timescale to the wave period. The authors found that the effect of an harmonic waveform can be compensated by the conventional calibration, but relaxation effects are particularly important if the calibrant and analyte species are not different. Sorry, if the calibrant and analyte species are different. In particular, when the calibrant and analyte have a similar relationship between mass to charge ratio and ion mobility, for example, if they belong to structurally similar classes of compounds, the resultant error may be significantly smaller than the absolute relaxation shift. This means that the calibration function in traveling wave should account for similarities and dissimilarities between calibrants and analytes with respect to the mass to charge ratio. And based on this, they have proposed a new calibration function shown on the bottom right corner of this slide with 4 degrees of freedom, and this includes the concept of the mass to charge dependence. And the relation of the CCS with the mass to charge ratio and the dependence on the chemical class is not a surprise. I have taken this image from a paper of McLean group where we can easily visualize the relation CCS mass over Z that can be described by different power law equations according to the chemical class. A fifth hypothesis might be that the ions could enter the drift cell with different structural conformations. This is particularly important for large molecules like proteins, for example, whose conformation can change with many factors due to the sample preparation, pH, ion strength, coexistence of other compounds, ionization technique, as well as due to the ion mobility device itself. The ions can be affected by conformational changes during their way through the ion mobility device, and different geometries and instrumental parameters could affect their molecular dynamics, which take place at the sub-microsecond scale, giving rise to broadening of arrival time distribution or even distinct peaks. In a poster of ASMS of 2019, Richardson and co-workers acknowledged these important points. First of all, real traveling wave ion mobility are characterized by waveforms not perfectly sinusoidal. Waves travel in discrete steps rather than smoothly. Ions are not confined to the optical axis, and pressure and temperature experienced by the ions cannot be measured accurately. Although some progress has been made for understanding the physical mechanism of ion trajectories and velocities through a traveling wave device, because of all these points, the use of calibration equation is still necessary for deriving the CCS. In view of this, Richardson and co-workers consider the 6 parameters calibration similar to that seen previously that can correct for relaxation effects, and introduced a new approach to the traveling wave calibration where the nominal values of alpha and gamma are calculated for each ion for the selected traveling wave conditions and rescaled by dimensionless calibration parameter A and G. They introduced a new calibration parameter C, and multiply the average ion velocity by a correction exponential factor. In this way, not only velocity relaxation effects are accommodated, but also radial effects and velocity and voltage ramping, because we account for the variation of alpha and gamma during the ramp. They have demonstrated that this novel approach is also more resistant to overfitting compared to the sixth term. And for cross-validating this new approach, they have used quite a wide range of compounds, including lipids, peptides, native and denatured proteins, which unfortunately make this method impractical for routine analysis due to the long experiment time to prepare the calibration mix. And now the challenge is to find a stable calibrant mix, easy to prepare, that can be used for ideally any analyte. And this requires further developments and testing, and I think it will require some more time, but I also think that we are going towards the right direction. And this method is still in development, and I can't wait to experiment this new calibration approach myself. To summarize the key points that we made here, the derivation of CCS can be done via a primary method, that is the step field method on the drift tube, or via a secondary method, for example, the single field method on a drift tube, or the widely used power law calibration in traveling wave. We have seen that different classes of compounds can produce different calibration functions, and we also advanced some hypotheses that may help us find an explanation. With this respect, the most recent works are very promising, and we will likely assist to significant improvement in the calibration function for traveling wave ion mobility, which might sort out the chemical class dependency and can potentially be applied to any compounds with minimal deviations. And finally, the the derivations um, of traveling wave CCS from first principles is still not possible, although some progress has been made, and maybe one day we might assist to the development of a physical equation similar to the fundamental law field ion mobility equation that can be applied to traveling wave, and maybe taking into account the velocity relaxation, anharmonic correction to waveforms, high field effects, wave stepping, and off-axis ions. We never know. With this, I want to thank you for watching. In the next video, I will show some commercial drift tube and traveling wave systems, and I will speak about the measurements uncertainty of the fundamental ion mobility equation used in the drift tube step field method. Again, feel free to comment and let me know your thoughts via LinkedIn and ResearchGate. Ciao.